Hello, I am Dr. T.K. Rajendran. I teach at University College, Trivandrum. Today I will be speaking about postcolonialism. The word postcolonialism means something that comes after colonialism. And colonialism, is a practical side of imperialism. And now what is imperialism? Imperialism, is a strategy whereby a state extends its control beyond its geographical boundaries to other nations. This is a possible definition of imperialism. And this control may not always be political or military in nature. This can be a cultural control or an economic control. We can identify three major phases in the history of imperialism. The first phase in the history of imperialism, modern imperialism, was from 1492 to mid 18th century. The second phase was from mid 19th century to the First World War, and the third phase is during and after the Second World War. So, these are the three major phases of imperialism. So, now let us consider the first one. The first phase was from 1492 to mid 18th century. During the first phase, sailors from the major European countries like Spain, Portugal, Britain, France went to different parts of the world as part of geographical discoveries, and they started colonies all over the world, and they were armed with better technology, and so it was quite easy for them to establish their colonies all over the world. And in 1492, Columbus reached America, and he wanted to discover a possible sea route to India, but he landed in America, the new continent. And then in 1497, Vasco da Gama reached India. So, thus in the first phase, European sailors from Spain, Portugal, Britain and France reached different corners of the world, and they established their colonies all over the world. So, armed with better technology, it was quite easy for them to establish colonies in Asia, in Australia, in Africa and in America. So, thus during the first phase, they established colonies all over the world. Perhaps the only resistance the European colonizers faced in India was the Kolachel War of 1741. So, during the Kolachel War of 1741, the Dutch army was defeated by our King Martandavarma Maharaja, and 28 top officers of the Dutch army, including Captain Delanoy, were captured by the Travancore army, and they were brought before the king. And King Martandavarma Maharaja offered two options to them: either to end up in the presence of Travancore or to join the Travancore army. and accordingly most of them joined the Travancore army, and Captain Delanoy was a military strategist, and he modernized the Travancore army and the Travancore navy, and he was appointed as the Velia Capitan of the Travancore naval force, that is the senior admiral of the Travancore naval force. And he built some forts for Travancore like Vattakottai, Udayagiri Kota and the like, and he was buried in the Udayagiri Kota. And this was perhaps the first successful resistance to European colonization from India. And after the Kolachel War, the Dutch never returned to India. So, thus in the first phase, these European colonizers established their colonies all over the world. The second phase in the history of imperialism was from mid-19th to the First World War. And what is special about this phase is that the European colonizers fought among themselves over the possession of the colonies. So, that is the most important feature of the second phase. They fought among themselves over the possession of the colonies. The third phase is during and after the Second World War, in which many of the European colonies became independent and the process of decolonization began. So, that is what is special about the third phase. And this third phase can be considered as the starting point of post-colonialism, the starting of post-colonial world. Now, imperialism has been justified on several grounds. One is that it is justified on the economic ground. So, imperialist strategies were adopted to ensure the economic strategies of the home countries, and in this way they justified imperialism. And the second ground on which they justified imperialism was social Darwinism. Charles Darwin had said about survival of the fittest, and in this sense colonization can be considered as a struggle for survival, and only the fittest would survive in this struggle for survival. So, this was how they justified imperialism. And the third ground on which they justified imperialism was what is called the white man's burden, that is the moral responsibility. They believed that it was their moral responsibility to bring the fruits of a better civilization to the uncivilized people of the world, which means they believed that means the Europeans believed that they were the only civilized people of the world, and the rest of the people in the world were uncivilized, uncouth savages. So, colonization was justified on the ground that with colonization they could bring the fruits of a better civilization to the uncivilized people of the world. And this was what is now called the white man's burden, a poem written by Rudyard Kipling, the white man's burden. And what is the white man's burden? To educate, to civilize the non-Europeans of the world. And so, life of Kipling itself is interesting. Kipling was born and brought up in India, and he was born as the son of a British couple who were employed in the colonial service, and they were very busy, and the child was taken good care of by the Indian servants. So, Kipling had a very carefree childhood here in India till he became 5, and when he became 5 years old, his parents sent him to England for better education. So, there they entrusted the child with a British couple for giving English education, for giving him English education. And there he felt like a fish out of water, because in India he had a very wonderful carefree childhood. But soon, in course of time, he got adapted to the present situation, and he realized that he was basically and fundamentally an Englishman, and to recover his Englishness, he had to shake off his Indianness. So, the rest of his life was devoted to a process of shaking off his Indianness and recovering his Englishness. It is perhaps as part of this struggle that he composed the poem The White Man's Burden, and the same can be seen in the composition of his masterpiece book, The Jungle Book. And The Jungle Book is the story of a human child brought up by a fraternity of animals. And now it is obvious who is the human child and who are referred to as the fraternity of animals. And again, the name of the villain of the novel is also significant, Sher Khan, and Sher Khan is an Afghan name, and Afghan as the other to the Indian identity. So, all these are actually embedded within the text, that is the Jungle Book. So, thus he was pursuing different kinds of strategies to shake off his Indianness, to recover his Englishness. But the opposite was the case with the poet Sri Aurobindo. And so, there is a striking similarity between these two persons, Rudyard Kipling and Sri Aurobindo. Aurobindo was born and brought up in India, in Bengal, and his father was an ardent admirer of the British culture, and he wanted his children to be trained like English people. So, he banned all vernacular languages at his house, and the only language allowed within the house was English. And then when he became 5 years old, Aurobindo and his elder brother were sent to England for better education. There, Aurobindo's father entrusted the children with a British couple, and he gave them strict instruction as that the children should not be trained in any religion. But fearing damnation, the Orthodox English couple performed baptism for the two children. And years passed, Aurobindo's father died, and when they stopped receiving funds from India, the English couple sent the children back to India. And back in India, again Aurobindo felt like a fish out of water. But he realized that he was basically an Indian, and to recover his Indianness, he wanted to shake off his Englishness. So, just like Kipling, the rest of his life was devoted to pursuing Indian philosophy, and finally he became a sannyasi, a maharshi, and so he became Sri Aurobindo Ghosh became Sri Aurobindo, and he started an ashram in Pondicherry. So, thus there is a striking similarity between these two persons, Rudyard Kipling and Sri Aurobindo. Now, let us come back to our topic, postcolonialism. What are the aims of postcolonialism? The first aim is to re-examine the history of colonization from the perspectives of both the colonizer and the colonized, because colonization is almost like a double-edged sword. It has its impacts on both sides, on both the colonizer and the colonized. It is not at all a one-way process. And another aim of postcolonialism is to re-examine the process of decolonization, how far people become successful in decolonizing their minds after independence. And another aim of postcolonialism is to participate in the goals of political liberation. The first major postcolonial theorist was Frantz Fanon, the Algerian psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. He was born in 1925 and died in 1961. His most important contribution to postcolonial theory was the book The Wretched of the Earth. So, in this book, The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon analyzes the conditions and requirements of an effective anti-colonial struggle from a Marxist perspective. And he says that decolonization can be achieved through a violent political interference. And in this book, he says that the bourgeois phase in the history of the colonies is a useless phase. How? The colonial bourgeoisie, I mean the bourgeoisie of the colonies, were different from the European bourgeoisies. In Europe, the bourgeoisies were agents of change, and even Marx had acknowledged their significance in European history. They were agents of change. They evolved as an antithesis to feudalism. So, in that sense, they were agents of change in Europe. But the colonial bourgeoisie was not like that. The colonial bourgeoisie was trained by the Europeans. They were educated people, and that means they were educated by the colonizers, and their attitudes and their philosophy of life were in fact similar to those of the colonizers. So, after independence, when power was transformed from the European colonizers to the native bourgeoisie, it makes no difference. It makes no difference to the masses who still live in misery and hardships in the colonies. So, this is how he said that the bourgeois phase in the history of the colonies is a useless phase. Another major post-colonial theorist was Edward Scythe. Edward Scythe was born in 1935 and he died in 2004. He was born in Palestine, and later he went to the United States and he became a professor at the Columbia University. His most important contribution to post-colonial theory was the book Orientalism, published in 1978. So, this is a landmark text in post-colonialism, Orientalism. So, what is Orientalism? Orientalism refers to the misconceptions, prejudices of the Occidental people about the Oriental people. So, now there is a binary, the Occidental and the Oriental. Occidental refers to the Western countries and the Oriental refers to the Eastern countries including India, the Middle East, China, Japan. So, they belong to the Oriental. So, the Occidental people, that is the Western people, have a lot of misconceptions and prejudices about the Orient. All those misconceptions and prejudices about the Orient can be considered as Orientalism. So, Orientalism is a Western construction, of the Eastern people. So, they have so many misconceptions about the Oriental people, like the Orient is timeless. So, this is a stereotype of the Orient discussed in Scythe's book, The Orient is Timeless, which means the Orient is timeless because time is stagnant in the Orient, whereas in Western countries, in the Occidental countries, time is dynamic, highly dynamic. They are developing minutes by minute. So, their countries are highly dynamic, whereas time is rather stagnant in the East. So, naturally, a European tourist visiting India or the Eastern countries may have several misconceptions. He may think that he can see in India or in the Eastern countries what his country was like 100 years ago, which means his travel is not from one country to another, that is along a spatial dimension, but along a temporal dimension as well, because he hopes to see in the Eastern countries what his country was like 100 years ago. So, this is a misconception indeed. Orient as timeless. Another stereotype of the Orient is that Orient is bizarre and strange. And again, a Westerner may think that he can see a lot of strange spectacles in the East, especially in India, like snake charmers, street circus. So, these are very common in India, and also even wild animals are seen roaming in our streets. So, this is how they construct their notions of the Orient. So, the Orient is strange and bizarre. This is another misconception. Another stereotype of the Orient discussed in the text is their prejudices about the Oriental race. Their prejudices about the Oriental race. For example, they consider the Arabs as murderous, the Indians as lazy, and the Chinese as cunning. So, these are their assumptions about the Oriental race. So, this is another misconception constructed by the Western fantasy. And then again, yet another Western fantasy about the Oriental people is their sexuality, and they believe that the Oriental male are effeminate and impotent, whereas the Oriental female are exotically sexual. So, this is another misconception. So, thus they have a lot of such stereotypes of the Orient, and all these misconceptions can be considered as part of what Scythe calls Orientalism. Another major post-structuralist theorist was Gayathri Chakravarti's Pivak. She was born in 1942, and it was she who translated Derrida's of grammatology from French to English. And her most important contribution to postcolonial theory was the article Can the Subaltern Speak? So, here she introduced a term in postcolonialism, subaltern, and in fact that term was first introduced by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Subaltern originally meant an inferior officer in the army, but Pivak used the term to refer to the marginalized sections of the people in the colonies, the non-elite people of the colonies. So, they were subjected to, or they are subjected to, a double oppression, that is oppression from the colonizer and oppression from their own people. So, that means the magnitude of oppression is much bigger in their case. So, the marginalized sections of the people of the colonies are referred to as subaltern by Pivak. And then another major theorist of postcolonialism is Homike Bhabha, another Indian theorist, and he was born in 1949, and he contributed much to postcolonial theory. Terms like hybridity, third space of enunciation, ambivalence, mimicry were introduced by Homike Bhabha. And hybridity refers to a hybrid culture consisting of elements from both the colonizer and the colonized, and all these terms are related to one another: hybridity, third space of enunciation, and ambivalence. Third space of enunciation means there can be a space occupied by the colonizer, and there can be another space occupied by the colonized, and there can be a third space in which both of them can meet and mingle, and the result is the formation of a hybrid culture consisting of elements taken from both the colonizer and the colonized. So, that means we can borrow from the colonizer so many positive things, and so that means thus we can make a hybrid culture consisting of what is good in the colonizer and what is good in the colonized as well. So, this culture, this hybrid culture is the product of the third space. And then ambivalence is a term borrowed from psychology. In psychology, ambivalence means loving and hating a person at the same time, and the colonized has an ambivalent attitude to the colonizer, loving and hating him at the same time. So, that is why I told you that all these terms are related to one another: hybridity, third space, and ambivalence. Mimicry refers to the blind imitation of the colonizer. An example is the character Lacanly in Wole Soyinka's play Lion and the Jewel. So, in postcolonial practices, postcolonial literary practices, we can see a lot of examples. We can even offer a postcolonial reading of Shakespeare's play The Tempest, where Prospero can be considered as the usurper, the colonizer, and he colonized the island which originally belonged to Sycorax and her son Caliban. And Caliban, he tried to educate Caliban, and Caliban said, "You taught me language and I learned how to curse you." So, the same was the case with the colonizer also. And so, Prospero did all these things with the help of his magic, and what was the magic in the hand of the Europeans? Definitely better technology. Science and technology were the magic in the hands of European colonizers, and it was with science and technology they became successful in establishing colonies all over the world. So, this again there is a term coined by Edward Scythe, that is contrapuntal reading, that is reading any text from a post-colonial perspective. So, from post-colonial perspective, it is easy for us to offer a post-colonial reading to the nursery rhyme, Baba black sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 bags full, one for my master, one for the boy, one for the dame, and one for the boy who lives down the lane. So, in this nursery rhyme, this seemingly innocent nursery rhyme, so we can see some colonial undertones. So, Baba black sheep, why black sheep? So, that color is significant. Why black sheep? So, obviously it refers to the non-European colonized. Have you any wool? Wool here refers to the colonial product. Have you any wool? That is actually the colonial product. Then look at his reply. Yes sir, yes sir. So, this was how the colonized addressed the colonizer. Yes sir, 3 bags full, one for my master, that we can understand. One for the boy who lives down the lane, can be maybe the shepherd, that too we can understand, but who is the dame? So, here we have to understand the dame as Queen Victoria, because during the Victorian age, 1/3 of the colonial product was levied as tax to the crown. So, thus we can offer a contrapuntal reading of the nursery rhyme Baba black sheep. So, this is definitely a kind of strategy to read a text from a post-colonial perspective. So, this is a brief introduction to post-colonialism, and thank you.